Very happy to be here, and what a day it has been. Inspiring presentations that inspire fear, anger, concern, but certainly also a healthy sign that we're doing what is necessary to bring about change. Because how do we bring about change? First, we build scientific knowledge and evidence. We actually transpose that into societal consensus, and that brings politics and policy into action. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. And I have done something very dangerous. I mean, with all the interesting presentations that I've heard this morning, I've decided to change my presentation at the last moment, which means you will not see anything on screen, but I will give it to the secretariat afterwards so they can put it on the website. But I want to run through a couple of things on this global approach to solving the problem of plastic pollution. And it's sort of looking at, is it time for action? What is the basis for action? What are we actually, at what milestone are we? What is the possible theater where we can bring about the next step? Looking at what could be the elements of a global agreement on plastics, and finishing off with what's the challenge? What can still hold us back? And I think that I've been involved with the issue of plastic for a couple of years now, being in the forefront of establishing the EU plastic strategy. And also, if you don't see any straws in restaurants anymore, you can blame my team, because we've written the Single-Use Plastics Directive. So I think that's something that has been, I think, really visible. It's one of the first times I have been able to tell anybody around the dinner table, and they say, "What are you doing?" And I say, "I'm taking plastic straws away from you," and other things. So that's always was a good conversation starter. But time for action. We have growing attention towards the issue. I don't need to spend much time on that. We've heard it all day. There is, however, a very clear understanding that there's urgent need for action throughout the entire plastics life cycle. Although there was a lot of talk about waste, I think we need to talk about pollution. And pollution starts at the moment of production and design. It's actually happening throughout consumption and distribution. So I think we need to look at the whole life cycle. So waste management is not the answer. Waste management is one of the answers, but not the answer. Then also, no single jurisdiction can do it alone. That's why we need global action, but we don't have a dedicated international agreement that specifically addresses the problem. We have something about transboundary shipment of waste, we have something about chemicals, but it's all fragmented, and we have hundreds of small initiatives which are all valuable, but are not scaled up and don't bring change at greater level. Now, we can ask you, what is the basis for this action at the global level? How can we actually start to do this? I mean, the issue of prevention of plastic pollution in the marine environment and other environments has been on the international agenda for years. We have resolutions in the United Nations Environment Assembly since 2014. Every resolution starts with business as usual is not an option. Yet, business as usual has been going on because there were important players that wanted to say, oh, let's try voluntary activities, let's try self-obligation of industry. The market will all do it. I think the market hasn't done it. And the ad hoc expert group under UNEA has worked for 4 years now and has identified a number of options that we could take forward. But one of them, and I think in the view of the European Union, its member states, the option that we need to do is we need to negotiate a legally binding agreement on plastics. And the legally binding agreements on plastics must close regulatory and governance gaps that exist along the full life cycle. And those governance gaps at the international level notably exist upstream. And we just talked about co-production. It's about information, it's about transparency. It's about knowing what is traded internationally to enable national decision-making. We have had a moment in 2019 at UNEA 4 where we were close and where a first resolution draft was on the table, which was shot down, to be quite honest, by a coalition of unwilling, and we couldn't go any further. But the concurrent discussion on single-use plastics at that assembly provided a rallying point for a number of countries that are willing to go forward, for a growing public coalition of NGO stakeholders to actually trying to do something. And there is a coalition in the making of countries from all continents, north and south, poor and rich, which under the leadership of Peru and Rwanda are trying to sponsor a resolution at the upcoming fifth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, trying to establish a international negotiating committee for a global agreement. And I think that I'm happy to say that the EU and its member states have been actively involved, and based on our internal commitment with circular economy, with the European Green Deal, with the plastic strategy, we are actively working with I think right now we're talking about 50+ countries to bring about that resolution, which should have a broad mandate, which should identify the key elements of the global response strategies, addressing, and I cannot repeat it often enough, the whole life cycle of plastics, from the design of materials to design of products, to the consumption and use phase, to the disposal phase or the recycling. And I think it's all clear to us who have an interest in the plastics life cycle. Recyclability is decided at the moment you design the material. If it's not at that stage, there will not be any useful recycling happening. I think that everybody comes back and saying, well, there are hundreds of valuable initiatives at local, regional, national, global level that voluntarily go in that direction. But I think companies, economic operators, need specific objectives and targets to address, because the market is filling all the space. Every economic activities will use every economic opportunity unless there are boundaries drawn by governments. And boundaries in the global market cannot be drawn by national governments alone. In developing and implementing our own plastic strategy, it became very clear to us that we will not make it if we don't put in standards and rules at the global level. Because we're connected with China, we're connected with India, we're connected with the United States. Even if the EU single market is an incredibly powerful tool in that regard. So I think what are we going to do in that agreement if it's up to us? We actually would want to address product design, material design, and use. We want to make it compulsory to establish national action plans to prevent, reduce, and remediate plastic pollution, tailored to local and national circumstances. But in addition, because national action plans will rely on transparency and information, establish such obligations for global supply chains of plastics and chemicals. And I think a lot of the presentations that you have heard this morning clearly indicate that that's what we need to do. We actually also need to establish mechanisms for monitoring and reporting on the progress in the implementation of the agreement, but also monitoring and reporting on plastic pollution, coupled with scientific and socioeconomic advice and guidance, and financing. I think that's clearly one thing where we need to put in tools that will actually support those countries who find it hard to implement such agreements, to effectively do what they most need. And that we've seen the horrible pictures of what's happening in some Asian and African countries in this regard. And I think we have to recognize our responsibility in Europe in that regard, because we are partially feeding that as well. Now, I think that from my perspective, we are at quite an interesting point. When we left Nairobi after UNEA 4, we were actually quite disappointed and at the same time energized. And we've spent the last 3 years building a sort of global consensus in view of launching negotiations. And I think we are at the stage where today, if you ask me, we are no longer discussing whether we will negotiate an agreement. We're discussing what type of agreement we will discuss. And I think that's the next big challenge. We need to build global consensus about the ambition for such an agreement. And for that, we need to mobilize stakeholders, including business and industry. I heard earlier today a question, I think it was from Adam, does industry see that it needs to do something? And I think that industry needs to understand that if plastic should remain a part of our lifestyle, plastic has to change. Plastic has to become sustainable. I think plastic will have to stay. I think we need to eliminate the plastic that is unnecessary, but plastic is a good material if you produce it right, if you use it right, and if you dispose of it in the right way. So I think the main challenge that we now have in the next couple of months, how can we avoid watering down and narrowing the scope of negotiations? The negotiations, I'm confident, will start next February. And then the hard part comes. We actually need to hammer out what we will actually have as obligations in that regard. But I think the facts are clear, and all the presentations I've seen this morning confirm we need to do something about plastic pollution, and it's not enough that we do it at the national level in the Netherlands, at the European level in the European Union, or in any other jurisdiction. We need to link those jurisdictions together by something that has an impact on global supply chains. That's the only way to address it. Otherwise, addressing marine litter is like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket that has no bottom. So I think that is our, I would say, common endeavor. I think that there were many scientists in the room, many activists. I think you're providing the evidence, you're providing the mobilization, and I think that's a good starting point, and let's keep up the good work. Thank you very much.